The doorbell rang on a Tuesday evening right as my boyfriend Jake and I were settling in to watch a movie. We'd just ordered Thai food, and it had arrived about 20 minutes earlier, and we were halfway through our pad Thai with the opening credits of some action movie rolling when we heard that distinctive ring doorbell chime. I glanced at my phone to see who it was because we weren't expecting anyone and Jake was already getting up saying he'd get it. Probably just a package delivery or something. I looked at the Ring app on my phone and saw a woman standing on our porch. She looked familiar, but I couldn't quite place her. She was visibly pregnant, maybe 6 or 7 months along based on the size of her belly, and she was dressed nicely in a maternity dress and cardigan. Jake opened the door and I heard him say, "Vanessa, what are you doing here?" And my stomach dropped because Vanessa was Jake's ex-girlfriend from about 2 years ago. They dated for almost 3 years before breaking up. And I'd never met her, but I'd seen photos and heard stories. My name is Brittany Walsh, and I'm 27 years old, and I'd been dating Jake for 18 months. We lived together in a small house we rented in the suburbs, and up until that Tuesday evening, I thought our relationship was solid and drama-free. But the moment I heard Jake say Vanessa's name, I knew something was about to go very wrong. I walked to the front door and stood next to Jake, who looked completely confused. Vanessa was crying, tears streaming down her face, mascara running, her hands protectively on her pregnant belly. She looked at Jake and said, "I'm so sorry to just show up like this, but I didn't know what else to do." "I needed to tell you in person," Jake said. "Tell me what?" And Vanessa took a shaky breath and said, "The baby is yours, Jake. I'm 6 months pregnant and you're the father." The words hung in the air for a moment while I processed what she'd just said. Jake's face went white, and he said, "That's impossible. Vanessa and I broke up 2 years ago. We haven't seen each other since." And Vanessa shook her head and said, "No. We saw each other in March, remember? You and Brittany had that big fight about her job or something, and you came to the bar where I work and we talked, and one thing led to another." Jake was shaking his head saying, "No, that never happened." And Vanessa said, "Yes, it did. You were drunk and upset, and I was comforting you, and we ended up at my place. It was just one night, but it happened, Jake, and now I'm pregnant, and the baby is definitely yours." I stood there trying to remember March. Jake and I had definitely had a fight that month. It was about my job. I'd been offered a promotion that would require some travel, and Jake had been weird about it. We'd argued about trust and independence, and it had been a rough few days. But I didn't remember Jake going out to bars or staying out all night. In fact, I was pretty sure he'd been home with me the whole time. I said, "Vanessa, when exactly in March are you talking about?" And she said the weekend of March 15th and 16th. It was a Saturday night, and I felt this calm certainty settle over me because I knew exactly where Jake had been that weekend. We'd made up from our fight on that Friday and spent the entire weekend together. We'd barely left the house. We'd ordered food in and binge-watched a TV series and had make-up sex and talked through our issues. Jake had not gone anywhere. But I didn't say anything yet because I wanted to hear more of Vanessa's story. I wanted to see how elaborate her lie was. Jake was saying I wasn't at any bar in March. "I don't even know where you work." And Vanessa said you seemed to know that night. "You showed up and you were really drunk and you kept saying you needed someone to talk to." She pulled out her phone and said, "I have receipts, Jake. I have proof." She showed us what appeared to be a hotel receipt from a hotel downtown. It was dated March 16th, and it had a name that looked like it could be Jake's, though the quality was poor and it was hard to read. She said after we left my place, we went to this hotel because my roommate came home. We spent the night there. I have the receipt and I have text messages. She scrolled through her phone and showed us screenshots of text messages that appeared to be from Jake's number. Messages saying things like, "I need to see you and I can't stop thinking about you, and let's meet up tonight." The timestamps were from mid-March. Jake grabbed her phone and looked closer at the messages and said, "This isn't my number." "I mean, it looks similar, but the last 4 digits are different." And Vanessa snatched her phone back and said, "You must have used a different phone, or I wrote it down wrong, but I know it was you, Jake. I know what happened." Jake was getting agitated, saying, "This is insane, Vanessa. I didn't sleep with you. I didn't go to any hotel. I don't know whose baby that is, but it's not mine." And Vanessa started crying harder, saying, "How can you deny this? How can you look at me pregnant with your child and just lie? I thought you were a better person than this." I said maybe we should all sit down and talk about this calmly, figure out what's actually going on here. Vanessa looked at me for the first time and said, "Who are you?" And I said, I'm Brittany, Jake's girlfriend. We live together. And she said, oh, so you're the one he cheated on. I'm sorry you had to find out this way, but Jake isn't who you think he is. I invited Vanessa inside because I didn't want to have this conversation on the porch where neighbors could hear. We all sat in the living room, Jake and I on the couch and Vanessa in the armchair across from us. Our Thai food was getting cold on the coffee table, and the movie was still playing with the volume muted. It felt surreal. Vanessa launched into her story. She said she and Jake had stayed in touch after their breakup, just casual, friendly texts every few months. And in March, when Jake had shown up at the bar where she worked, he'd seemed really upset. She said they'd talked for hours, and she'd closed up the bar and they'd gone back to her apartment. She said they'd slept together, and it had felt like old times. She said Jake had left the next morning, and they'd exchanged a few texts, but then he'd stopped responding. She said she didn't realize she was pregnant until about 6 weeks later, and by then Jake had blocked her number. She said she'd tried to reach out through social media, but he'd blocked her there too. She said she'd been trying to figure out what to do for months, and finally decided she had to come tell him in person because he deserved to know he was going to be a father. The story was detailed and emotional, and if I hadn't known for certain that it was false, I might have believed her. She was a good actress. Jake kept denying everything, saying he'd never blocked her because he'd never had any contact with her to block. He said he didn't even have her number anymore. He said he definitely hadn't slept with her, and he definitely hadn't been to any bar or hotel in March. Vanessa said she needed child support. She said she was a single mother now, and she couldn't afford to raise this baby alone. She said Jake needed to step up and take responsibility. She said she wanted $50,000 up front to cover her medical expenses and the first year of the baby's life. And then she wanted ongoing monthly support. Jake said, I'm not giving you money for a baby that isn't mine. And Vanessa said, fine, then we'll do a paternity test after the baby is born. And when it proves you're the father, I'm filing for full custody and maximum child support. You'll regret not handling this the easy way. I've been quiet through most of this, letting Vanessa tell her story, but now I said, Vanessa, can I ask you something? What bar do you work at? And she said the Blue Moon over on 5th Street. And I said, and you said Jake showed up there on March 15th. And she said, yes, Saturday night. And I said, and you closed up the bar and went to your apartment and then to a hotel, and she nodded. And I said, okay. And what time did Jake leave the hotel? And she said around 9 or 10 in the morning on Sunday the 16th. I pulled out my phone and opened the Ring app. I said, that's interesting because we have security cameras all around our house. Front door, back door, garage. And according to the footage, Jake never left our house that entire weekend. I pulled up the footage from March 15th and 16th and started playing it. You could see the front door with timestamp. Jake wasn't on it because he never went out. I showed her footage from Saturday evening showing us getting food delivered. Saturday night showing us letting our cat out and back in. Sunday morning showing us in our bathrobes getting the newspaper. Continuous footage showing Jake had been home the entire time. Vanessa's face changed. The tears stopped. She looked angry now instead of sad. She said cameras can be faked. And I said not Ring cameras, not with their cloud-based timestamp verification. But if you don't believe me, I also have our credit card statements showing we ordered food delivery both nights that weekend. I have our Netflix watch history showing we binge-watched an entire season of a show that weekend. I have text messages between Jake and me throughout those days. I have everything, Vanessa. Jake was with me the entire weekend of March 15th and 16th. He never went to any bar. He never went to your apartment. He never went to any hotel. So I need you to explain to me whose baby you're actually carrying, because it's definitely not Jake's. Vanessa stood up and said, this is ridiculous. I don't have to listen to this. And I said, actually you do, because you just tried to extort $50,000 from my boyfriend by lying about paternity. That's fraud, Vanessa. That's a crime. You could go to prison. She headed for the door and I said, before you leave, I should tell you that I'm a paralegal and I work for a family law attorney. I know exactly what the penalties are for false paternity claims and attempted extortion. And I've already saved all of this Ring footage to multiple locations, including sending it to my work email. So if you try this again, or if you contact Jake again, or if you spread lies about him, I will file charges and I will sue you. Vanessa turned around and said, you can't prove anything. And I said I can prove Jake wasn't where you said he was. I can prove those text messages weren't from his number. And I'm guessing if I do some digging, I can find out who the baby's actual father is. And maybe this isn't the first time you've tried this scam. Her face went even more pale, and she said, I don't know what you're talking about. And I said, I think you do. I think you're pregnant, and you're panicking about money, and you thought you could convince Jake he was the father even though you know he's not. I think you targeted him specifically because you know he has a good job, and he's a decent person who would take responsibility. But you didn't count on security cameras and a girlfriend who pays attention to details. Vanessa left without saying anything else. She got in her car and drove away. Jake and I stood there in our living room processing what had just happened. Jake was shaking. He said, I can't believe she tried to do that. I can't believe she made up that entire story. And I said, I know, it's crazy. He said, thank God for those cameras. If we didn't have footage, I don't know how I would have proven I wasn't there. And I said, exactly. That's why I insisted we get the ring system when we moved in here. You never know when you'll need proof of something. He hugged me and said, you were so calm through all of that. How were you so calm? And I said, because I knew it was a lie. I remember that weekend clearly. We were together the whole time. There was never a moment where I thought her story might be true. He said, still. You handled that perfectly. You got her to tell her whole story, and then you just calmly destroyed it with evidence. I said that's what working in law has taught me. Never react emotionally, gather facts. Present evidence, let the truth speak for itself. We sat back down to our cold Thai food and tried to finish the movie, but neither of us could focus. We kept talking about what had happened and trying to understand Vanessa's motivation. Jake said we dated for 3 years, and I thought I knew her. I thought she was a good person. I never would have expected her to do something like this. And I said people do desperate things when they're scared. She's pregnant and probably the real father isn't in the picture, and she panicked. Jake said, but why me? Why come after me specifically? I said probably because she knows you're stable. You have a good job. You're not the type to abandon responsibility. She probably thought she could convince you, and you just pay up rather than deal with the drama of a paternity test and legal battles. It almost worked too. If we didn't have that footage, you'd be in a terrible position. You'd have to wait months for the baby to be born and then do a paternity test. And in the meantime, she'd be telling everyone you're a deadbeat dad who abandoned his pregnant ex. I couldn't stop thinking about it, though. Something was nagging at me. The whole thing had been too elaborate. The hotel receipt, the fake text messages, the detailed story about the bar and the apartment. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment lie. This was planned. I said to Jake I want to do some research on Vanessa. I want to see if I can find out what's really going on. He said, what kind of research? And I said social media, public records, maybe reach out to some of her friends. I just have a feeling there's more to this story. Jake said, okay, but be careful. I don't want her accusing us of harassment or stalking. And I said, I'll be careful. I'm just going to do some basic internet research. Nothing invasive. I started with Facebook. Vanessa's profile was semi-public, so I could see some of her posts and photos. I scrolled back to March and the months following. She'd posted a few things about pregnancy, but nothing identifying who the father was. She'd posted some vague things about being disappointed in people and having to do things alone. I looked at her friends list and started clicking through profiles looking for anyone who might have information. I found a girl named Chelsea who seemed to be close with Vanessa based on frequent tags and comments. I sent Chelsea a message saying I was trying to reach Vanessa about an urgent matter, and did she have a better phone number for her? Chelsea wrote back saying she hadn't talked to Vanessa in a few months. They'd had a falling out. I said, oh no, what happened? And Chelsea said she didn't really want to get into it, but basically, Vanessa had asked her boyfriend for money claiming she needed help with medical bills. And it turned out to be a lie. Chelsea said she'd lost trust in Vanessa after that, and they'd stopped being friends. That was interesting. I asked Chelsea if she knew anything about Vanessa's pregnancy and who the father was. Chelsea said she knew Vanessa was pregnant, but Vanessa had told her 3 different stories about who the father was. First, she said it was some guy she'd met at a bar. Then she said it was her ex-boyfriend from college. Then she said it was a married man she'd been seeing. Chelsea said she didn't know which if any of those stories was true. Chelsea said, honestly, I think Vanessa has some serious issues. She lies about things constantly, and I just couldn't deal with it anymore. I thanked Chelsea for the information and kept digging. I found another friend of Vanessa's named Marco who had commented on several of her pregnancy posts. I messaged him asking if he knew who the father of Vanessa's baby was. Marco responded saying he didn't know for sure, but Vanessa had told him it was a guy named Derek who'd wanted nothing to do with the baby. I asked Marco if he had Derek's last name or any way to contact him. Marco said he didn't, but he knew Derek worked at the same restaurant where Vanessa used to work before she moved to the Blue Moon. I asked what restaurant, and he told me it was an Italian place called Giovanni's. I looked up Giovanni's and called them. I asked if Derek still worked there, and the person who answered said yes. Derek was working tonight, actually. I asked what time his shift ended, and they said 11 p.m. I told Jake I wanted to go talk to Derek, and Jake said, "Are you sure that's a good idea? What if he's dangerous or something?" And I said, "I'll be fine. I'll meet him in a public place. I just want to hear his side of the story." Jake said, "Then I'm coming with you. We're doing this together." We showed up at Giovanni's at 11 p.m. and waited outside. When Derek came out, I approached him and said, "Are you Derek?" He looked confused and said, "Yeah. Who are you?" I said, "My name is Brittany and I need to talk to you about Vanessa." His whole demeanor changed. He looked angry and tired. He said, "What about her?" And I said, "She's claiming my boyfriend is the father of her baby, and we know that's not true, and I'm trying to figure out what's actually going on." Derek said, "Jesus Christ." He ran his hand through his hair. He said, "Okay, we should probably talk. There's a diner across the street. Let's go there." The three of us went to the diner and ordered coffee, and Derek told us his story. Derek said he and Vanessa had dated briefly about 8 months ago. They'd worked together at Giovanni's and had a fling. It wasn't serious, but they'd slept together a few times. Then Vanessa started acting weird. She told him she was pregnant and he was the father. Derek said he was shocked because they'd used protection every time. He said he told Vanessa he wanted a paternity test, and she got really upset. She said he was calling her a liar. She said if he didn't trust her, then they were done. Derek said he insisted on the test, and Vanessa eventually agreed, but then she kept stalling, making excuses about why they couldn't do it yet. Finally, Derek said he went to a lawyer and got a court order for a prenatal paternity test. Vanessa had to comply, and when the results came back, Derek was not the father. Derek said he confronted Vanessa, and she admitted she'd lied. She said the real father was some guy who'd ghosted her, and she thought Derek would be a better dad. Derek said he broke up with her immediately and told everyone at work what she'd done. That's why Vanessa left Giovanni's and got a job somewhere else. I asked Derek if he knew who the real father was, and he said no. Vanessa never told him. He said after the paternity test came back negative, he wanted nothing to do with her. He said she'd tried to trap him and lied to his face for months, and he was done. I said, "Has she contacted you recently asking for money or anything?" And Derek said no, but he wouldn't be surprised if she was running the same scam on other guys. He said she seemed desperate for money and willing to lie to get it. Jake said, "Do you think she's running this scam on multiple people at the same time?" And Derek said, "I don't know, but based on what I experienced, I wouldn't put it past her. She's very convincing when she wants to be." Derek gave us the name of the lawyer he'd used and said if we needed help with anything, he'd be willing to talk to them or testify or whatever. He said Vanessa needs to be stopped before she ruins someone's life. We left the diner with a lot more information than we'd started with. Jake said so she tried this with Derek, and it didn't work, so now she's moved on to me. I said it seems that way, and I'm guessing there might be others. Jake said, "What should we do?" And I said, "I think we need to go to the police. What she's doing is fraud. She's trying to extort money from you with false paternity claims. That's a crime." Jake said, "Will the police actually do anything, though? She hasn't succeeded in getting any money." And I said, "I don't know, but we should report it anyway. Create a record in case she tries this with someone else or tries to come back to us." We went to the police station the next day and filed a report. The officer who took our statement said, "Unfortunately, this kind of scam is more common than people think." He said, "Without actual financial loss, it's hard to prosecute, but having a report on file is important." He said if Vanessa tries to contact Jake again, or if she escalates, we should call immediately. About a week later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and a man's voice said, "Is this Brittany Walsh?" I said yes. "Who's this?" He said, "My name is Connor Mitchell, and I'm calling because I saw a Facebook post about Vanessa Patterson, and I think she might have tried to scam me too." My heart started racing. I said, "Tell me what happened." Connor said he'd dated Vanessa briefly about 6 months ago, just a few weeks. And then she'd contacted him 2 months ago saying she was pregnant with his baby. Connor said he'd asked for a paternity test, and she'd agreed, but then she kept canceling appointments. Finally, he'd gotten suspicious and hired a private investigator. The PI had discovered that Vanessa had told at least 3 different men they were the father of her baby. Connor said he'd posted on a local Facebook group warning people about her and asking if anyone else had similar experiences. He said several people had reached out to him with stories about Vanessa lying or scamming. I asked Connor if he'd gone to the police, and he said yes. He'd filed a report similar to ours. He said the police had told him the same thing. Without financial loss, it was hard to prosecute. But if they could find multiple victims, maybe they could build a case. I told Connor about Derek and the prenatal paternity test that proved Derek wasn't the father. Connor said that's exactly what I needed to hear. That proves she's lying about paternity. I said I think we should all get together. Everyone who Vanessa has targeted, and we should coordinate our reports and information. Maybe if we pool our evidence, the police will take it more seriously. Connor agreed and said he'd reach out to the other people who'd contacted him after his Facebook post. He organized a meeting at a coffee shop. 8 people showed up. There was me and Jake, Connor, Derek, and 4 other men who Vanessa had told they were the father of her baby. We went around the table and everyone told their story. The timeline was damning. Vanessa had approached each of these men over the past 6 months claiming they were the father. She'd used the same basic story with slight variations. She'd shown them ultrasound pictures. She'd asked for money ranging from $20,000 to $60,000. None of the men had paid her because they'd either demanded paternity tests or gotten suspicious and investigated. But the pattern was clear. Vanessa was systematically trying to scam men into believing they'd fathered her child. One of the men, a guy named Travis, said he'd actually paid her $5,000 before he got suspicious and demanded it back. She'd returned the money, but only after he'd threatened to go to the police. We compiled all our evidence, the fake text messages she'd shown different people, the hotel receipts that were clearly forged, the inconsistencies in her stories, my Ring camera footage showing Jake hadn't been where she claimed, Derek's paternity test results, everything. We took it all to the police together as a group. This time the police took it much more seriously. With 8 victims and clear evidence of a pattern of fraud, they opened a formal investigation. They said they'd need to verify some of the information, but it looked like Vanessa could be charged with attempted fraud, extortion, and possibly identity theft for the fake text messages. We all gave statements and signed affidavits. The investigation took about 6 weeks. During that time, we found out from the detective handling the case that they'd interviewed Vanessa, and she'd claimed she was confused about who the father was because she'd been seeing multiple people. She said it wasn't fraud, it was just a mistake. But the detective said her story fell apart when they confronted her with the fake hotel receipts and text messages. Those weren't mistakes, those were deliberate fabrications. The detective also told us they'd located the real father. A man named Justin, who Vanessa had been in an on-and-off relationship with for years. Justin had confirmed he was the father and said he'd told Vanessa he wanted nothing to do with the baby. He said Vanessa had then started trying to pin the pregnancy on other men to get financial support. Vanessa was arrested and charged with multiple counts of fraud and attempted extortion. The bail was set high because she was considered a flight risk. She couldn't afford it, so she stayed in jail awaiting trial. Her public defender tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor wasn't interested given the number of victims and the calculated nature of the fraud. The case went to trial 4 months later. All 8 of us testified. We presented our evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before coming back with guilty verdicts on all counts. The judge sentenced Vanessa to 3 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 months. She also had to pay restitution to Travis for the $5,000 she'd taken from him plus damages. The sentencing happened about 2 weeks before Vanessa's baby was due. There was some discussion about delaying her prison time until after she gave birth, but the judge ruled that she'd receive adequate medical care in the prison system, and her actions had consequences. Vanessa gave birth in prison to a baby boy. Justin decided he wanted to be involved after all and filed for custody. With Vanessa in prison, he was granted full custody, and the baby went to live with him and his mother. There was something tragic about the whole situation. A baby born to a mother in prison. A mother who'd lied and schemed and tried to trap multiple men into taking responsibility for a child that wasn't theirs. All because she was desperate and made terrible choices. Jake and I tried to move on from the whole experience, but it took time to process. Jake felt violated by Vanessa's lies. He felt like she'd tried to ruin his life. And if we hadn't had security cameras, she might have succeeded. I felt angry that someone would be so willing to manipulate and deceive people, to lie about something as serious as paternity, to try to trap men into financial responsibility for a child that wasn't theirs. We talked about it a lot in the months following the trial. We went to couples counseling to work through the trust issues it had created, not between us, but in general, the fear that people could lie so convincingly and that we needed to be more cautious about who we let into our lives. The other men who Vanessa had targeted had similar experiences. Connor said it made him extremely hesitant to date anyone new because how could he trust that they were being honest with him? Derek said he'd become almost paranoid about contraception and always insisted on using multiple forms of protection. Travis said he'd developed anxiety about any woman he dated asking him for money, even for legitimate reasons. Vanessa's actions had ripple effects beyond just the immediate fraud. She'd damaged these men's ability to trust. She'd made them suspicious and guarded in ways they hadn't been before. And for what? For money she never actually got, for a scam that ultimately landed her in prison and cost her custody of her child. I think about that baby sometimes, the innocent child born into this mess, growing up knowing his mother is in prison for fraud, knowing she tried to pin his paternity on multiple men who weren't his father, knowing she was willing to lie and manipulate to get money. What kind of impact will that have on him as he grows up? Justin seems like he's trying his best. From what I heard, he's working with his mother to raise the baby. He's getting support from social services. He's doing the right thing even though Vanessa tried to exclude him initially. But that baby deserved better than the circumstances he was born into. He deserved a mother who made better choices, who didn't prioritize money over integrity, who didn't lie and scheme and hurt people. The security camera footage that saved us that night is something I still think about. If we hadn't had that ring system installed, if I hadn't been able to pull up time-stamped video proof that Jake was home that entire weekend, we would have been in a nightmare scenario. We would have had to wait months for Vanessa to give birth, then fight for a paternity test, spend money on lawyers, deal with social judgment and accusations, all while knowing the truth but having no way to prove it. The cameras cost us maybe $200 total to install, and they saved us from potentially years of legal battles and tens of thousands of dollars in costs. They also exposed Vanessa's pattern of fraud and helped protect 7 other men from being her victims. I've become an advocate for home security systems since this happened, not just for safety, but for evidence. I tell everyone I know that you need cameras at your home. You need to be able to prove where you were and what you were doing because you never know when someone might accuse you of something false. I tell the story about Vanessa to friends and family as a cautionary tale, about how convincing liars can be, about how important evidence is, about how you need to protect yourself even from people you used to trust. Jake's experience with Vanessa taught us that people can change or maybe reveal who they really were all along. The woman Jake dated for 3 years and thought he knew became someone willing to commit fraud and try to ruin his life. Whether she was always like that and hid it well or whether desperation changed her, we'll never know. The legal system worked in this case, but it almost didn't. If we'd been alone without other victims, if we hadn't found Derek and Connor and Travis and the others, if we hadn't pooled our evidence and presented a united front, Vanessa might have gotten away with it. She might have moved on to victim number 9 or 10. She might have eventually found someone without security cameras who couldn't prove they weren't where she claimed they were, someone who would have paid her just to make the problem go away. The fact that it took 8 victims and 6 weeks of investigation and a trial to get justice shows how difficult it is to stop this kind of fraud, how much burden falls on the victims to prove they're not lying, how the system is set up in ways that can protect manipulators if they're clever enough. My boyfriend's ex showed up at our door 6 months pregnant claiming he was the father from a hookup in March. She had hotel receipts and text messages, and a detailed story about the bar where they met and the night they spent together. My boyfriend was terrified and panicking, but I pulled up our Ring camera footage and showed timestamps proving he'd never left our house that weekend. He was with me the entire time. The footage exposed her lie immediately and completely. But that wasn't the end. I investigated further and found she'd tried this scam on at least 7 other men. She'd systematically targeted them with false paternity claims trying to extort money. We all went to the police together, and she was arrested and convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Her baby was born while she was incarcerated and given to the actual father. And I learned that security cameras aren't just about safety, they're about truth. They're about protecting yourself from lies. They're about having evidence when someone tries to destroy your life with false accusations. That Ring camera footage that saved us cost $200 and about an hour to install. It provided time-stamped, cloud-verified proof that destroyed an elaborate fraud scheme. It protected my boyfriend from years of legal battles and false accusations. It helped convict a serial scammer and protect other potential victims. And it taught me that in a world where people can lie convincingly about anything, evidence is everything. Your word against theirs means nothing without proof. But security footage with timestamps and verification is irrefutable. Vanessa learned that the hard way when her detailed story crashed against the reality of video evidence. You can't argue with a camera. You can't manipulate a timestamp. You can't lie your way around footage that shows exactly where someone was and what they were doing. That's the power of evidence, and that's what saved us from a nightmare that would have destroyed our lives if we hadn't had proof of the truth.